An article that John McDonnell has written for us at Flow News 24. You may have heard in the last 24 hours the discussion about whether we are poking the bear with the situation with China and or whether there is some particular role for us to play in the region, and whether China can actually launch strikes against Australia. Well, in the latest edition of what's called the Saturday paper, the Emeritus Professor of Strategic Studies at the ANU, Hugh White, wrote an article entitled, and this pretentiously, "It would probably be the biggest war since 1945 and very likely a nuclear war," quote. Professor White was talking generally about the prospects of war breaking out between the United States and China, but in the course of his dissertation, he made the point that Australia should stop making inflammatory statements about conflict with China and avoid being seen as acting in concert with the United States on a policy of containment of China. In making this point, Professor White was foreshadowing a view put forward by a Chinese professor of Australian Studies at China's Normal University in Hong in Monday's Global Times, where he wrote, "The previous weeks saw a series of military strident remarks from Australia's top officials, ranging from Prime Minister Scott Morrison and Defence Minister Peter Dutton to current Home Affairs Secretary Michael Pizzula, whipping up Canberra's bellicosity toward the One China principle." So this is the remarks that was made by China. They're having a look at the Australian politicians and in their own paper, if you like, in China, commenting on their position. When asked about the possibility of conflict over Taiwan, Scott Morrison said Australia would stick by its international obligations. As Cheng Hong acknowledges, this includes an agreement with China that Taiwan is a province of China. The only basis for an international conflict would be if China launched an unprovoked attack on China. The Chinese say the reunification of China is a sacred duty of the Chinese people, but this does not mean that there needs to be an attack on Taiwan, and the only time one would occur would be if Taiwan declared independence. That's coming from China. And in these circumstances, John writes that the US would not come to Taiwan's assistance. Peter Dutton simply said that the prospect of conflict over Taiwan should not be discounted, which is a statement of the bleeding obvious, says John. Mike Pizzula, while talking out of turn, merely made the point that certain elements of the Chinese society were talking aggressively about China's reunification. Nevertheless, as Professor Hugh White makes a good point in his article when he says that it is not in Australia's interest to become engaged in a conflict with China, or for it to be part to a policy of containment, because either way Australia would be the loser. And John further states that Australia would be unlikely to have the capacity to engage in a China containment strategy before 2050, when the current shipbuilding program is complete, which is a long way off, 30 years, isn't it? Moreover, Australia is vulnerable to a potential missile attack from China, and the reality of this is Professor White believes that these threats should be taken seriously, and that, however, given the command and control centre for any US operation would be connected to and operate through Pine Gap, it may be difficult for Australia in its current position to remain outside of this particular conflict if the United States and China were to move in that direction. I think that when the Australian government particularly has got stronger on foreign investment on Australian land, and the reality of the circumstances of where we've seen China moving into the Pacific in different realms, in different ways with Pacific Island nations, and I think the Australian government's comments up to now over New Guinea and the possibility of China building a satellite city just north of Cape York Peninsula, I think that may well be why you've seen commentary from the Australian government. And added to that, over the ownership of Australian land, a lot of commentary around that from local politicians like George Christensen, who does hold a North Queensland seat and obviously has the right to comment on the circumstances of how he sees a threat to people that live in the northern part of Queensland if that there were to be further building of Chinese assets north of our country. And at the same time, I think Australian government has to look at its foreign investment plan and where that foreign investment comes from. And China isn't the biggest foreign investor at the moment in Australia. That is actually coming out of Britain and also the United States and Canada superannuation type funds. So there is still, though, a lot of blustering going on, and it never is easy and never is good when there is commentary surrounding China's capability of being able to launch a long-range missile attack on Australian soil. But the circumstances surrounding those comments need to be carefully analysed.